Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Well, hi, Shelby. So I'm Alec. I run HomePros. We're basically a publication, and we cover the HVAC industry, and we write about technologies and trends and legal developments and kind of things happening in the market. And we get the opportunity to talk with people like Shelby. And so Shelby and I were talking, wanted to set this up to kind of just dig into like different sales technologies, talk about sort of the history, kind of where things are at now, technology wise, process wise, like how things have changed, how they will change, and just have kind of a good sort of like informative conversation. So that's what we're going to do. So again, I'm Alec. I run Home Pros. Shelby, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Amazing. Well, super excited to be with you today. I'm Shelby. I'm one of the co-founders here at Conduit Tech. We build load calculation and sales tooling to help every HVAC pro stand out on site by engaging their customer in a completely different way. And what that leads to is selling with high quality work at higher ticket sizes and higher conversion rates. And so for us, we really believe in how can you use high quality work as that differentiator. And that's what we've been building for the last couple of years. And that's what we're continuing to build. So excited to talk about all of these different topics.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think like maybe a good way to do this is we'll kind of go in sort of like in sequence from a time standpoint. So past, present, future, etc. So like okay, so like let's talk about the past. So obviously heating and air conditioning, the whole industry has been around for forever, for a long time. And technology has changed a lot, especially in the past 20 or so years. But a lot of the like underlying processes and like sort of ways that the industry works and that contractors run their companies have started to have changed recently, but for a long time they didn't. So kind of, I'm curious as to like what your thoughts are and how you view sort of the past when it comes to the sales side of an HVAC company. And you can take that however you want, whether that's tech wise, process wise, et cetera.
I love it. So the past on the sales side was a lot of doing things in a very typical way. So there's like the old school method, which I will cite as Derek from Service Business Evolutions. He's defined this like old school versus new school. But the old school sales method was a little bit higher pressure. It's what you think of when you go to like a car dealership, and that
Right.
method was more around, let's talk, let's like do some showmanship. But ultimately, when it came to the equipment, there weren't really any tools to effectively design a system. There weren't so many different models, different options. There weren't so many really sophisticated elements to be considering every step of the way. And now when you think about, what is it that your HVAC pro can even offer? It's so much more expanded than it ever was before, because you're thinking about ducted, you're thinking about ductless, you're thinking about comfort concerns because these systems in the past were not designed as thoughtfully because they couldn't be. You're thinking about ductwork, you're thinking about IAQ, you're thinking about the list goes on and on. And so what that means is the list of solutions goes on and on. And people are spending a lot more time in their homes than they ever did before with the rise of remote work, all of the transitions that happened in COVID. But there is so much that's changed about both the customer as well as about the HVAC industry and happening at every single level of the industry. And so what you've seen is that there's this crop of amazing companies that are spurting up and really growing because they've invented or taken a different approach to sales that is entirely consultative and about how do we customize this experience for every homeowner. So you're buying your HVAC system becomes much more like buying a house or much more like buying something that you think a lot about. And it is crazy because the cost of the systems and the cost of the installations have also gone up so dramatically that you need that process in place. Because I don't know about you, but I don't know a single person who just has $20,000 in cash laying around. And if they do, amazing for them. Congratulations. But this is a really major life decision for a lot of customers that they weren't anticipating. And so the process has to change to reflect that because it's not going to be $3,000 anymore.
Right. Yeah. So I think like an interesting point on that is that it was more like the sort of old school sales method is way more like pushy or like what you'd consider or what you would compare to like some other industries. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is the main problem with that just that like customers have changed, their behaviors have changed to where they just do not want to buy from someone who they feel like is just pushing something on them, or like I don't know, I'm trying to think of the source of the change and like why all of a sudden this is just not the right way to do things when it was for so long.
I think this is maybe it was never the right way to build to do it, and that's one thing that I think that some of the contractors that we work with are consistently challenging is that there is more that can be done for that customer to show the craftsmanship and the work that's being done. And I'll actually just throw up a page that sort of showcases this, but like what were some of the issues in the older school process? So there's not enough trust built. There's limited effective communication and explanation how the solution helps. And I think this contributes to a view of HVAC as a commodity product or a commodity service, which we all know is not the case. There's a lot of work that goes into it. And I think people actually liken it to buying a car, except when you go to a dealership to buy a car, you truly can go to the dealership 5 miles away and buy the exact same car because they were all made in the same manufacturer's facility. But when it comes to HVAC, you have I don't know, a 35-part checklist just on the installation. That's not even including design. That's not including handoff. That's not including the site walkthrough. But just on installation, you have so many steps. You're building the car on site. So it really does matter who you go with. And almost no homeowners understand that. I think the next piece is that one of the things that people want is they want this experience to be about them. As a
Right.
millennial, I will say we are a more selfish generation, and we want this experience to be customized to who we are. And I think that's true about a lot of the new homeowners that are out there. And I think that the other piece is that people want information, they want data, they want the risk of buying to be alleviated because there is so much risk in every one of these decisions. And I think honestly, the cost is a big factor, which is now that this is not a small, it's not a small, it never was a small ticket, but it certainly isn't now. And how do
Right.
you actually justify that and really believe that you're making the right investment? Because it is an investment. So I think in terms of what's happening from a shift is it takes time and data to build trust and rapport. It also needs new tools to communicate why you're different, why this is going to be the right solution, why you're actually building that car on site, and why building that car on site right matters more than just a simple quote or a simple piece process. I also think this is where customization and adjusting the closing process to that homeowner, to that person is really, really important and valuable. And it's also about highlighting that commitment to quality. And I think there's so many different ways that the best companies are doing this. One is through their extended warranties. Another, of course, one I feel passionately about is load calculations. The other
Right.
piece is full home evaluations. These all matter so much to be able to paint that case of what is going on here? Why does it matter? And why should you go with us? Because if the homeowner comes at this with no knowledge, which typically they do, they don't know how to make that decision. So it's the person in that role who has to help them make that decision.
Right. Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. I think so. So with that said, a lot of time has gone on. There are a number of different things today that make it like a way better experience, just in general, now than in the past. How do you like? There's a couple different ways in which you can take this, but what would you consider some of the big categories of some of the technology that has been sort of invented or created and deployed since then? Because obviously, there's everything from, okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, I guess just kind of curious, maybe let's talk a little bit about, and I'll go back and kind of probe you some questions, but just the different categories and sort of the hows and whys behind maybe even just a few of them. We don't have to go into all of them, but
Yeah, because there's so many categories now, which is overwhelming.
right,
But what it starts with is there's sales, design, field service management. That's sort of that upfront piece of how do you even get to the home and how are you communicating inside the home?
right,
The second half of this page is outfitting, measurement, commissioning, maintenance. That's everything from doing the work. And so this is one thing you and I were just talking about is there's this entire life cycle of that customer that you're experiencing that you have to coordinate. And that is a lot. But there are so many innovations that are popping up. And I think the first one that we really saw was field service management. That's the one that came in the last 10 years. That's laid the foundation, I think, for a lot of the new sales and design tooling that's coming up. So that's our service titans, our house call pros, our pazers. Those all exist to support the contractor in figuring out, how am I going to best serve this customer? How do I even get to that customer? How do I manage this information? And that laid the foundation to be able to layer on everything else because you now have a central piece to manage that customer from.
right. And I think the underlying technology, like the underlying technology is what enabled all those things to come out. So before that, it was you had these on-premise software systems where you had all this data being collected out in the field and it was written down on paper or whatever it may be, and then they had to physically bring it back. And then once everything comes back, then you have to enter it in physically in your system, whatever it may be in your office. But there wasn't like a sort of like live channel back and forth from somebody who's on the road and somebody's like house and like your office, 6 miles down the road. And so I think what happened was the underlying technology, whether it was just even just like cell service, like mobile technology, the cloud, where you can actually take all the data and you could store it in, instead of having to have it on a physical like piece of equipment in your office. So I think that was like the unlock for field service management. To your point, since then, that has created just a ton of value for people, both those companies and obviously the contractors. And as that's happened, there's been some other technology sort of like foundationally that's kind of progressed. And I think that's kind of what leads us to this next wave of like, okay, on all those categories, what can be done? So I think,
no, I think that's it's such a good point. And some of the things that we're seeing here are the cost and efficacy and the rise of AI. That's something that we're seeing from that companies like predictive maintenance or voice software is being able to take advantage of. There's new business models emerging. There is what I will say is like to your entire point around like internet cloud computing and then also accessibility to internet, like to actually having fast internet on a tablet in the field. That did not exist even 5 years ago to the same extent it does now. And the field service management providers had to wait for that to really be a place. I mean, I don't even know if the iPad's been around for 10 years now, but maybe it has. And so what you have is like a whole suite of technology and tools that can be built on top of like internet connectivity, cloud computing, and it getting faster and better every single day.
Yeah. So I know you said earlier you were biased a little bit or towards like the load calculation component to it, but maybe like what's an example of something that really like gets you excited and as a result of all this stuff now, like what's one thing that you think is awesome, and then I'm curious why.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick just one. So I'll share some examples from other companies that we're seeing as well. But I mean, for us at Conduit, like we are super passionate about the use case of LiDAR. That's actually the core of what our technology is built off of. So it's a 3D modeling tool that's available, again, in technology. And this technology has only existed on the market for 3 years. But it's available in iPad Pros and iPhone Pros to scan homes, build 3D models, 2D floor plans, super accurate dimensions. Which can be used in so many different ways, especially in HVAC. That's one piece. We also are super excited about augmented reality. So how can you visualize things inside of your home that you've never been able to visualize before? Those are my two favorite that we use at Conduit, but I think also really cool to see is just incredible companies like MeasureQuick, Smart AC, ReloVoice. They're all using different types of technology. So MeasureQuick is using connected Bluetooth probes. They are connecting data coming off of systems and being able to process it and analyze it and make that barrier to entry to a role of a technician much lower to increase the access to these opportunities. I think then like Smart AC, what they're enabling people to do is both homeowners and contractors to evaluate and monitor systems over time with similarly sensor data. So they're using different connected probes that they've built out that are super easy to install, using that to monitor data and then draw conclusions off of that. And then lastly, ReloVoice is another one. They're more based off of AI. And what they're able to do is draw conversation insights from recorded conversations and really make it applicable to train and coach people. And I think what's cool about every single one of the technologies I just named is it's actually providing a sense of skill development or a sense of resources that contractors can lean into without having to learn every single skill in the trade. I think you still need the foundations, you still need the theory, but it makes some of these jobs more accessible to it and still requiring a significant amount of talent, but much more accessible.
Yeah, I think, and all those, even the few companies that you name, I mean, even whether it's Smart AC, like you guys, I mean, it's maybe 5 years old, 6 years old at max or something like that. All of those companies. Yeah. So yes. I think it just proves that idea of once the technology catches up, once the technology gets there, what can happen in such a short amount of time and how quick all that stuff can sort of deploy, I think is noteworthy. So So you mentioned, okay, so going back to the two things that obviously at Conduit that you guys deal with the most, whether that's LiDAR and then augmented reality that excites you. Could we like I'm curious, like let's talk about examples. So like how like if I'm a contractor and I'm having a conversation about this stuff and I'm interested and like I get it sort of like I get kind of the premise behind all of it, but I want to understand just in really simple terms, how could I actually utilize that? I guess we'll start with maybe the LiDAR component. Like how does that actually work?
Yeah. So it's as simple as you get access to our software on your iPhone Pro or your iPad Pro. You take the cameras and you scan the home as you walk through. So you're
Okay.
building out a 3D model as you go, and you're moving the camera up and down, literally just as simple as something like this, and tilting it a little bit, and you're getting the angles. And what it's doing is it's sending out of this like back right here. It's sending light beams out, measuring how long it takes for those light beams to come back, and that's how it's measuring distance. But it's doing this for windows, walls, doors, all of that. And what you end up with is a 3D model customized to that home. You're going to have a 3D representation of that home, but all
Okay.
of the like personal details, which I literally have none behind me, but if I did, like all of the photos, all of the stuffed animals, if there were any, like would be completely missing. They would be empty because they're not structural elements of the home. And so what it does is it makes it a very cool customized experience for the homeowner without being too personal. And I think that's what's really important. It's the same thing, when somebody walks into the home, it's like, you don't want to say like, oh, like you have a beautiful family. That's like a little too personal.
Sure.
But saying something like, oh my God, I love your landscaping. It's so stunning. It feels far less personal. And I think that's sort of the same level there. And for us, what we're using for that 3D model and that 2D floor plan, so the 3D model sets the foundation for what's called a load calculation. So you can determine the heating and cooling loads of a given home and size the right HVAC system based off of things like the building materials, which we pull in from property data, the design conditions for that particular area, for that zip code, which just means how many really hot days, how many cool days
Yep.
do they have, and what is that temperature continuum. And then what we're also taking into account is building orientation coming off of a compass
Mhm.
that's embedded in these devices, as well as thinking about windows, walls, and doors, their dimensions, and the surface areas. And then finally, the heat transfer across all that. So that's a lot of information. But as the contractor, what you're doing is you're putting in the address, you're customizing some of the inputs that we're going to give you if you want to, and then you're scanning the home and you're done. And it enables you to get to a really accurate calculation, but in a fraction of the time that something like this would take. And you're engaging the homeowner as you go because you're walking through the home, you're having them scan if they want to, and you're talking about each room as you walk through. And then you're talking about why you believe in taking a more scientific based approach to sizing their system. And that leads them to then question their next quote, which is, oh, this guy, walked through the home. He came up with a really detailed quantitative analysis on the system. You know, why aren't you doing that? But it really shows the commitment to quality and then enables you to weave in some of the other things that you're doing as a company to drive that. So for example, one of the reasons we do a load calculation, one of the reasons we do system design is we want to make sure you're incredibly comfortable. But we also offer you a 5-year labor warranty, which many companies don't do, but we really want to stand behind our work. And one of the ways we make sure is we're running this analysis for you. So it's just important as you think about your company. That's one thing that's really important for us to offer to our homeowners.
Yeah. And do you think at a high level, like at least this is my thought, and I mean I think it's right. But like a big I think driver of adoption in these kinds of things. So you have it's there's clearly a logical benefit to leveraging new technology to do things quicker, better, easier, faster, cheaper, whatever. But do you think a big driver of the adoption like of this stuff now is competition, whether that's consolidation in the space, so that whether that's these kind of larger, more financial backed companies, like just being a lot really sophisticated. And so if you're kind of a smaller independent contractor now in your market, whether you're in, doesn't matter which city you're in, like there's a number of other independents, but then you also have these sort of like gorillas that exist. And
Yes.
so a big question for you is, okay, differentiate like in terms of differentiation, what do we do? And so do you think that's what drives this kind of stuff, or at least a big driver of what drives of this kind of stuff?
Absolutely. Because I think, like, first off, Eventually, this is sort of like field service management tooling. Eventually, everybody will have it, but still today, I think there's only 40 or 50% penetration of field service management platforms. It might be far lower than that, but I think
There,
the
yeah,
first is
yeah,
it
yeah.
like what is it?
Yeah, not to cut you off. No, not to cut you off. I remember I used to, so we used to, from the company I worked at prior, there was a chart we would look at a lot, and it was essentially a pie chart of adoption of field service management software, and it
Yeah,
was, I forgot the number, but it was green. It was just mostly like at least it was
untouched.
actually more than 50% was just pen and paper. Yeah, even though you have these, what seems like everyone sort of has just at least a basic software system, most people don't, or at least a large percentage don't.
Which is
Anyway,
crazy
I didn't
because
cut you off. Yes.
no, no, no. It like it has such a powerful impact on streamlining things for you. And I think for us, even like that means that 50% of the market is I don't know what they're doing. I actually don't know how they're running their business, but good for them
Right.
because that's impressive. And I
Right.
think the same thing is true here, which is like if many companies don't have the opportunity to do a load calculation today because it's really expensive. And it's not so expensive if it takes one, 8 minutes, but two, if it also is your one of your tools to build value. And there's plenty of tools to build value, but what's challenging is that everybody is quoting, good, better, best. Everybody is thinking about, financing. So many companies are thinking about each piece of this. Everybody's using it. Well, not everybody. 40 to 50% of the market is using a field service management platform. And what you're going to see is that the levers if everyone's offering those, you have to do something differently to differentiate yourself. And there's a couple things that you can do to differentiate yourself, and I think frankly it's a combination of all them. It's some of the technologies I just mentioned earlier, whether they be Measure Quick or Smart AC or Rilla, to coach your team members differently. But a lot of it actually comes down to time on site and building a relationship, customizing that experience for that customer, and really engaging them differently. And no matter what technology you have, that's something that it takes, a talented person to do, but using tools can really, really help change that because you have another thing in your arsenal to differentiate. And I think that's what's so cool about being an early adopter of any of this technology. Anytime I talk to one of our customers who is one of the early service Titan users, they always tell me I was an early service Titan user, and I'm like, that's great because you're now you're the first couple 100 contractors on Conduit. And so
Right.
you are an early Conduit customer. That means you're the first in your market. Like I can almost always, even though we're in 37 states, I think at this point, a lot of those contractors will never ever see anyone with our platform. And I think that's what really is awesome is like you're the leading edge and people are going to remember you're the leading edge. And that's going to stick with them that you do things differently. And that is an opportunity to build value always.
Right. So I have one question, but I have a pre-question sort of. So LiDAR was one big component, but then there's also the AR stuff. There's augmented reality. Just quick like example of that. I know you gave a great example on the LiDAR component, which I think was like
Yeah.
it's sound, it's logical, it's simple. But what about on the augmented reality side?
Yes. So I have actually never used one of these, full disclaimer, but you can visualize in your home like what a couch is going to look like. The one I have used actually is from like Warby Parker, which is a glasses company, where you can
Yeah.
visualize what
Yeah.
these glasses are going to look like on
Yeah.
your face. Honestly, they
Right.
all look bad on me. So like it's not a really great conclusion coming out of that experience, but it's more about the glasses than it is about the augmented reality. And what I think is really powerful is HVAC, when you are suggesting a new system and especially if you're talking about like ductless mini splits, or you're doing a heat pump retrofit on a home that's never had air conditioning or never had a heat pump before, that's going to look different. The customer should be aware it's going to look different. There's going to be a sizable outdoor unit. If you're doing a ductless install, there's going to be either indoor heads, there's going to be a floor console potentially, you might have ceiling cassettes. How do you help a customer understand what that's going to look like so that once it's installed, they're not upset? And that's where this is where we started leveraging augmented reality to visualize, here are your, 3 mini split placements that you can have in this room, because these are the three areas where we can get that refrigerant line appropriately set up, and showing it to the customer, asking them what they find as the most appealing, if that's what they're choosing to go down the path of, and then having a conversation about that. So I think that's one of the things that we see is so powerful here is it's about using design as that communication tool. And I can guarantee you that very few people are doing that today because there's not a great way to do that. And if you are doing it differently, customers feel bought in. They're part of that process now. They're part of that design process, and they're making choices. It doesn't feel like it's being pushed down upon them, which is so amazing. And it's one of the reasons my favorite thing is when I onboard a new team and a customer comes to that onboarding and they're like, oh yeah, I already sold a system using your visualizer tool. Like, I don't know how to do a load calculation, but I was able to use the visualization tool right off the bat. I don't need training on that. I need training on, how I use something else in the platform. But they're like, I've already sold one of these because the customer was so wowed by how I was able to show them their different options. And by the way, I've now handed that off to my install team who now knows exactly where they need to install this.
Yeah. Does this kind of stuff get cheaper? This gets cheaper over time generally and easier and faster, like just definitionally,
Absolutely.
right? Right. Okay. And then and I also think another part of it maybe is like its weight. So like I always like, I always like to make fun of, not to pick on it, but like make fun of sort of like virtual reality, because it's just that from a hardware standpoint, it's like super heavy, it's just clunky. And like I think until it gets to a certain point where it's either physically like really small, or it's able to be smaller, but like it's much more sophisticated and fast and quick and whatever. Like I don't see how it gets really, really like it gets mass adoption. And so I know it's a little different considering augmented reality. There's not like I mean, there you have hardware, but the hardware is like an iPad or something that is already, deployed. But I think, yeah, it's just interesting to think like, okay, now it has to get even faster, a little better, like smoother, and then maybe even cheaper too, as it like really like the curve sort of like starts going up. Um,
It's so true. And this is even like just a very tactical example. So we use our platform is designed primarily for iPads. So we also have an iPhone option,
mhm.
but it's designed for iPad Pros. And they just came out with like these beautiful new models. And I always love when they come out with new models because that means like the prior models get cheaper. But
Right.
not only is that true to your point around getting cheaper, better, but the new models are like super thin, super sleek. Like they just look stylistically better, but they're also faster, better.
Yeah.
They're not cheaper, but they made the rest of the models cheaper. And I think that is like exactly to your point is that technology is becoming more and more commoditized and more accessible to many, many folks as a result. And that's one of the reasons we released like in beta, it's still in beta, an iPhone version for scanning was because 50% of the people we spoke to, they'll buy themselves the nicest iPhone out there.
Right.
And that means they already have the technology in their pocket and they had no idea, which is awesome. I had no idea when I
Right.
bought my iPhone that I'd have LiDAR on it because I didn't know at the time that I'd be working on a LiDAR based technology.
Sure.
And it's awesome because it's existed for 4 years, but now it's finally becoming applicable to really make a difference with.
Yeah. So on the so I guess like pivoting a little bit to like the workflow side of things. So if I'm an actual contractor, like I own the actual company, I'm a contractor. I don't want to have like 16 different things that I have to use and log into and deal with and own and whatever. Does This is kind of a two-parter, but is the phone or the iPad or whatever sort of like the main piece of hardware that's being used? Is that it? Like, does everything just get built around that without requiring like an additional piece of hardware? And then two, well, actually, I'll pause there. I'll start there.
Yeah, so that's exactly why we built for primarily for iPad because thanks to those field service management platforms, almost everyone is using 80% of companies we speak to are using an iPad in the field today. And they're not using an Android, they're using an iPad specifically.
Right.
And
Apple.
many of them are already using a Pro model that has LiDAR sensors in it. And
Mhm.
so we wanted to make sure people weren't needing to carry around a second device because we just knew that that's one more piece of friction to even, then you have to keep something charged, then you have to, all of the steps that just adds. So keep it super simple, use it on existing devices. And that's why the best form factor is an iPad version because that's what you're using to present to the customer at the kitchen table.
Right. And then on the software side, or at least just like from a usability standpoint, all this stuff, essentially like whether it's you guys and like some of those the other companies you listed, like the model or the strategy is to integrate with all of the core systems. So whether it's whatever field service management provider somebody's using, the idea is to integrate with it, because if not, like you're almost doing the reverse, like you're sort of adding friction. I understand in some cases it might require like a separate app or something, or like some component of like having to kind of go outside of a different system. But like, how are you guys thinking about that? Like, is that just black and white, the truth? Like it has to be done this way, or is there something else that I'm not considering?
No, for us, like it's all about developing a really seamless experience. And so we are building integrations right now with field service management providers, because that is important to not just us, but to our customers. You have to keep it as few steps to add on as possible, because the more you're requiring of somebody in the field, and that's what got me super interested in this industry overall, is that there's so much requirements of the professionals who are working in the field right now. What can you do to streamline it? So I think for us, we're always thinking about how do we streamline that entire workflow. Integrations are a big piece of that. And in a lot of these situations, some companies might be tempted to just build everything themselves. But the reality is like, we have something that we've built out that's really useful for our pros. How do we continue to improve upon that experience and build more for them that is very close to that initial experience, build exactly what they want and need to continue to grow their businesses? And a lot of these field service management platforms have done that already for field service management. So how can we make it simple for that entire customer journey?
Right. So, okay. So like looking out a little bit, like here, like that's kind of sort of like what's going on, or like what's happening now, how people, how things can be used, how they should be thought of going forward. You had an example earlier where you were like, okay, if every single company is sort of presenting options the same way, they're all integrating with the same lenders, and you're ultimately offering people the option to finance like a new installation, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if the price and like the usability of all of this new technology continues to go down and get easier, then you get to a point where everybody adopts that kind of this technology, and so that they just sort of add it to their checklist. How does that play out? If again, like the idea is, how do you differentiate now if everybody's doing the same three big things over here, and this just becomes a fourth thing? It's like what does that look like? I don't know. I'm curious your thought on that.
Oh, I love it, because like we work with hundreds and hundreds of contractors across the country right now. And we are at less than a fraction of the entire, like less than 1% of the industry do we have on our platform. So we have probably, like years, hopefully, not that many years, but we have years until we even hit, 1%, 2% of the industry. So we're first off so far from that. And just thinking about field service management, I love that example that we were just talking about, which is to me, I'm like, everybody has it. I literally said that multiple times, even after we said it's 40 to 50%. But that means that there's so much opportunity to even hit that threshold. And so I think that ultimately, what ends up happening is it does become a requirement. And then the question is, why didn't you do this? Why don't you offer this? And I think that's what financing has encountered over time, is especially as these systems have become so expensive, you can't not offer financing that will reduce your close rate. And you have to frame it in a way that makes sense. So I think there's two layers to this. Is one, it becomes a requirement, but the other piece is there's still people who are better at it. And that's where I think a really huge commitment to training, support, ongoing support and training of our contractors is really important to us, is because there's one thing about having the technology, but ultimately there's always going to be people who are power users or super users of that technology and know how to make the most of it in the home. And for us, our goal is to replicate that as much as possible. But that's where a lot of the individual initiative or management attention actually can drive the most value, is that it comes down to yes, this technology has almost become required, or it's become expected, which I think we're frankly many years away from that. There's still so much opportunity to be an early adopter of any of the technologies I just named. Not just ours, but I think that over time it becomes how do you use it better, which is what you see from the best companies today, is how do you engage with your customer better using this, and how much are you willing to invest in upskilling yourself to do that?
Yeah. There is another chart that we used to look at it, but there's some data out there. I'm forgetting where it is, but it's on implementation, the percentage of, even if you use just a field service management software, okay, you can buy it, and then, but it's a whole different equation to actually sort of implement it, put a person, and like to put a person on it and then like go through and like learn everything and train people on it and like get it to where it's sort of widely used. And so I think that's a good point. That was a good point from what I took away, which was like, yeah, technically everybody can have it, but I don't know. Some people might be better than others on actually doing something about it. Because yeah, I think I could say that I offer different options if I in my company's sales process, for example, but maybe my options are just pictures of birds or something like that. Like it's not actually a real, So I think I see what you're saying. So on on implementation, like what's been some of the things that just people or whether like contractors have told you like, hey, this is a hurdle for me, or like this doesn't work, or like I don't like this idea because of X. What are some of those things?
I think the biggest hurdle that we've seen, and we've been pretty, honestly, very fortunate that we don't see this very frequently, but I think it has to be a willingness to change your process, even if it's just a little bit. But you have to be willing to invest in process change, because if you're not, and this is why sort of my last point was just around like there are going to be people who just adopt it better and invest in adopting it better, and those
Yeah.
people are going to win every time, no matter what technology we're talking about. They're always going to win. And I think that's what we find is like my favorite companies to work with. The best implementations always have either really independent, strongly motivated individuals working at that company who
Yeah.
take it and run with it. And the owner says, hey, John's going to run with it. He's got it from here. And John's got it and he runs with it from there. And he takes complete ownership. He like coordinates trainings for the rest of his team. I actually do know a John who did this for his entire team. So I wasn't thinking about it, but now I am. But there's that type of model. And then there's the top type of model where the manager is like, guys, we know this is going to work. We've seen the results in other companies. We're going to invest in this. We're going to take advantage of every free resource that Conduit has to offer to make sure this is successful. And those two types of like models, both of them work super well. But what you do need is a willingness and a motivation to change for the better and improve your results. And
Mhm.
also the willingness to invest that like short term, like that short term, I wouldn't even call it pain, but that short term investment where you are
Yeah.
saying like, I'm going to be uncomfortable for a little bit. I'm going to be a little bit
Yeah.
uncomfortable with the fact that I'm not perfect at this. I'm going to practice either on my own time, or I'm going to accept that like one or two of my jobs, I'm going to be just working through this a little bit more. But I'm going to be ready for it. I'm going to invest. And I think that's the biggest thing. And for us, our onboarding process is pretty simple. We're there to provide as much support and training as any user wants, live training, custom for that user. But what we find is that folks who like invest quickly and just start going and start investing and then start reaching out to us to ask questions, those are the people who are always the most successful, and then report back to us, hey, I sold $200,000 of HVAC equipment in my first week of June. Those results happen when somebody is really invested and they are learning and becoming a master, and they're evolving not just with the technology, but evolving how they communicate with it.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that there was an example of on the AR side where just the visualization part of it, where somebody like said, hey, this is really great, and like they had some immediate sort of like sales bump or whatever it was. Is there anything like, and the reason I'm going to ask this question is I think there's a lot of the times when it comes to contractors implementing something, there's something that can sort of helps with that is what does their end customer, so what does the homeowner say once they've actually dealt with that technology? And so then it pulls them into making a decision and sort of adopting something like that because their customers really like it and they appreciate it for these specific reasons. Do you have any examples of like something that homeowners have said that they've appreciated about just this technology that their contractor has used? If I worded that wrong, that like, let me know.
No, I love this because this is something we were talking about. We recently saw this uptick in like the last couple of weeks. We always ask people, most of our new customers come from inbound. They reach out to us. We always ask them how they heard about us because
Yeah.
we don't pay for advertising. So we're like, how do you hear about us? I don't know. But we asked multiple customers in 1 week, and they're like, my homeowner asked me
Yep.
if I'd heard about this company called Conduit Tech, And they asked me if I could scan their home. And they're like, I couldn't scan their home. So now I'm reaching out and I want to learn more about this technology. And we had that happen, I kid you not, multiple times in 1 week, just a few weeks ago. And I was like, okay, this is one, a very powerful lever is that what happened clearly is that customer got a quote from somebody just because they were doing their diligence. They were a conduit user, and then they wanted to still see that analysis from the company that they've always used. And I would love to know whether they ended up winning that sale or not. But it is, I think that's where like we've seen customers. And then I think the customer testimonials are just incredible. Is like, this is what we hear from our contractors. Unfortunately, we don't know the customers directly, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. But yeah, it goes both ways. But what our contractors always tells us is like, to quote one of our users, he's like, I've never seen a homeowner not be impressed. And I think what I love about that is the work that every pro is doing in the field right now is very impressive. And it's more just how do you find a way to show that to the homeowner in a way that makes sense to them. And new technology that no one else is using is a great way to do that. And even when 2% of the market or 5% of the market is doing it, you're still going to stand out. And I think that's really important. And even if it hits 50%, that's you have different levers and you can adopt new features, and there'll be new technology then too.
Yeah. So not this is kind of more speculation, but like two of the big things you mentioned, there's LiDAR, there's AR. This stuff is real. Like, it's being used. People appreciate it. Or homeowners appreciate it. Contractors appreciate it. And like, it still has like a huge amount of room to run. At a certain point to our conversation, like, even though there will be people that are much better at using it than others, if everybody at some point, in theory at least, should have access, some relatively cheap access to this kind of technology, what happens next? Like, are there certain technologies that are kind of bubbling under the surface that you think have like some promise, but they're just like way too far down the line?
Ooh, that is a really good question. What I would say is there is more opportunity for advanced applications of AI and how you can use that to interact. So right now, like things like property data are not perfect, but how can you use like computer vision and AI to be able to make even better assumptions, better knowledge, even be able, like the equivalent of seeing through walls, like when can you get to that point? But I do think that you can, the more data that's out there, the more computing power that we have out there, the more that you can apply. And I would say we've started talking about internally, like what are ways that we can use AI to really like leverage and move the needle forward. I also think just the pace of development, this is, a very simple answer to that, but I think that what was really difficult to build 10 years ago is still very difficult to build now, but it's easier than it was 10 years ago because there's different tools, there's for developers as well. So I think just the pace of technology development is really accelerating. And I don't know if you have used, I use ChatGPT all the time, but I don't know if you like remember like the November 2023 version and like the November 2022 versions, but like you can see the leaps and bounds that are happening there with AI alone. And so that opens up like what is possible here and how can you creatively, as a software development company in our case, think about how to apply that. And I think that's actually going to be where a ton of the next frontiers come from. I think it's doing things like what we're doing, Smart IC, Measure Quick are doing, where we're taking sensors in hardware and then figuring out ways to really optimize them and use that as another data input, compute that with other things. I think there's going to be a huge wave in that. And I think there are so many things that we would love to build at Conduit. So I know that there's so much opportunity for innovation.
Are you guys keeping that trade secret for now, what those conversations are with different ways in which you can take advantage of all this stuff?
For now, okay. Yes.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think the ChatGPT example is funny because it's like looking back in November. What was it? Was it November? It was 2023, right? It was last year.
What is time though? I feel like it might have been 2022, but I don't know.
I don't know. It
All I know is it's leaps and bounds.
Yeah, right. And I think, but like another thing that's interesting though is like, yeah, leaps and bounds, but there's still a lot of like it will continue to do leaps and bounds, like because there's still things that are sort of like every once in a while kind of mess up with it. And so it just shows like, okay, yeah, it will get even that much better. I don't know. It's almost I can talk about that. I can talk about this for probably 30 minutes. But it's interesting. What about So separate, this is a little separate than like maybe the sales specific conversation, but the role of the contractor, and I guess this is a part of it because the contractor is being impacted by all this stuff, whether it's just purely or like artificial intelligence, whether it's LiDAR, et cetera, et cetera. Um, does the role of the contractor change as everything gets so sophisticated and as maybe homeowners behaviors drive they go elsewhere and change the way in which they discover contractors, in which they communicate with them, whatever maybe, does the role of the contractor change over the next, say, like 5 years?
This is so interesting because I actually read in a HomePros newsletter about how the average homeowner like wants a response in like 4 hours from their like whoever they
Right, right.
reach out to. Like they want to make a decision quickly.
Mhm.
I think the role of the contractor is changing. It's changed so much already, but I
Sure.
think it's also changed in a way that's so much more complicated that it almost like that it can't. I don't see a world where you have home service professionals or in-home sales people replaced. And the main reason that I don't see that type of change happening, so maybe I'm just indexing on one change. I do think the role is changing, but I
Yeah.
think that what was super interesting is like if everyone remembers like 2020, like the first 6 months of COVID, like nobody wanted anyone else in their home. And somehow everybody else just went back to doing in-home sales within like a year of the pandemic. And so that leads you to like wonder like, okay, there was a big shift away from that. And then we shifted right back to it. And what was like the underlying need for in-home sales? Well, it was the need for actually building that differentiation, building value, understanding what's actually going on in the home. You were going to need that visit either way. I think the shift that might be coming is people want more information before they come on, like before you come on site. They want as many questions answered. I think about this when I like book a demo of another software company is I want them to answer a few of my questions before I take the time to book a demo. And so I think there is like more behavior of like searching and trying to use resources online to better understand a company before even carving out the time to work with them, reading the reviews, going through all of that. I think that's the biggest shift that I'm seeing right now on like the sales side. I think there's a lot of other shifts happening throughout the industry, but I think my perspective is that in-home sales isn't going anywhere. It's just more like what is the knowledge that individual, that homeowner is going to have going into that in-home sale before that.
Yeah. I also think maybe like a part of that is that different like behaviors that happen in one industry like tend to trickle across different ones. Some just take longer. And so I think in this case, it's an extreme example of things taking longer, which has always been sort of behind in the sense, versus retail and a lot of these more high tech industries. But like, yeah, I think maybe it's just a part of that too, is that it's just behaviors that take time to cut across industries. And so yeah, I agree with you on the homeowner point on discovery and like upfrontness, for lack of a better term. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, and the reason I'm thinking about this is because I know a part of the conversation, which is mostly, again, it's kind of speculation at this point, but it is, are contractors at risk given all this stuff? Like, you're right. Salespeople are probably always going to have a need for an in-person salesperson or an in-home salesperson, but are they at risk, and do they become fulfillers and just installers essentially of work that technology has done on the front end to essentially sell the homeowner in the first place? That's something that I think about, which I think is, I don't know, it's kind of a black box.
I would totally agree with you. I think it is a black box. And I think that to me, I think that like in-home sales has at least for the next decade, will be here and will be a big, big role. I think beyond that, I would agree. Like, I think that there are many factors that would disrupt it. But then the last thing I always think about is like, okay, Amazon was like the online company, like they're the online store.
Right.
And then they went out and opened a bunch of physical stores. And so
Right.
you're like, ultimately there's still this like I don't know element of connection, tactile experience, but I think you're right, like that sales visit might change. It might happen at a different part of the process. It might happen in a different way. There might be more, I don't know what it is, but I think that the pace, what's interesting is I think the pace of change might be slower in home services from a customer demand perspective, just because the customers themselves, like the vast majority of homeowners are still, above the age of 40. and didn't necessarily grow up with the same level of technology as those who are under 40.
Right.
That's an arbitrary time period cutoff. I don't know what that right year is, but I do think that like it's a slower transition because unlike, Amazon where they might serve, a specific range of customers, and that's like the vast amount of people who are purchasing, the vast amount of people who are purchasing home improvement services actually doesn't match that same demographic. So it's just interesting. Like there's so much
Yeah.
that can be done, and I think it'll be a really interesting couple of years coming up.
Yeah. I think the point on Amazon building physical like infrastructure after sort of being kind of this online darling, I think that there's like the big picture kind of thing behind that is like that happened. I feel like that happens all the time. I feel like it's where it's just like a pendulum. Like some things go really far. They start over here, and then some, whether it's technology or just like pop culture or whatever it is, swings it all the way over here. So for we were talking about before this, it's ways in which to build a company. You have to go, you have to do it this way, and then all of a sudden now it swings. It's like, hey, actually, you should make a profit. Like, yeah, you should go this way. Or so maybe what happens is you have this element of like, okay, the industry is sort of speeding up in technology adoption. To your point, probably still has 5, 10 years, whatever it may be, till something like maybe drastic happens. But then does it just get to a point where the pendulum swings so far back that homeowners actually go, yeah, I really like having all these things that like what it used to be like, regardless of whether they're Gen Z, millennial, whatever, then it goes back. Then you gotta like, then you just have to sort of figure out where's the middle point, where's the equilibrium, like, and hopefully, I don't know, everybody's happy at that point.
Honestly, yeah, that's a perfect description. It's always changing.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It is. The Amazon thing is a good point. I haven't thought about that in a while, so it's interesting. Well, is there anything else like, okay, so like we talked about obviously like sort of on a timeline, like history, kind of what's going on now, kind of why this stuff matters. Obviously, there's a couple things that are occurring now, and there's really logical like reasons as for how somebody who is like an actual home service business or contractor can benefit from some of these things, and then just kind of some notes and stuff to think about as going forward. Is there anything that we missed?
I mean, there's so much,
Like
but
anything worth touching on? I mean, I'm just trying to think. Like,
I think we covered it. I think there's so much more outside of what we covered, that there are so many changes happening to this industry, and I think it's such an amazing time to be able to be part of it and hopefully build incredible tools and resources like you are doing for contractors. And I think it's such an exciting time. So there's so much to talk about, but we could be here for years.
right? Yeah, and I think it's exciting that a lot of people are also doing good, like doing the work. Like there's companies like obviously what you guys are doing, but then there's contractors. I know. Okay, this small rant. I'm sorry. We can end after this, but there's the labor issue. Everybody likes to talk about the labor issue in these industries, not just HVAC, but plumbing and roofing, and all the way down to manufacturing and construction. And there's one of the big arguments, or one of the points that's made on one side is, well, a lot of people don't want to work anymore. A lot of really young people, they're lazy. They don't want to work. It's like, and so that's kind of something that's being thought through. There was a thing that I saw once, and it's one of my favorite. It's a Twitter thread, actually, and I can send it to you. It's one of my favorite things ever. And it is a thread that has pictures in each individual section of a newspaper clipping from 1910 or 20, I think, and then it's every decade. So it's like 1910, 1920, 30, 40, 50, 60. And it's a picture of a newspaper article, like just a paragraph. And the paragraph is basically some author or some guy writing, nobody wants to work anymore. We're screwed. All the these industries that we're building, we're not going to be able to sustain them. We won't have the workforce. And then it goes 19 whatever, and it's like nobody wants to work. Nobody wants to work. Nobody wants to work. Nobody wants to do anything. And so it's been that way since like 1920. And so I think I digress. My point is that I think there's a lot of conversation happening on the labor side, and technology obviously plays a big part into that. And so that's just kind of something else that's a whole different conversation, but that I think is worth keeping in mind as you talk about that. Is I don't think that younger people are just like don't want to work. I think they do want to work, and I think they're going to be fine.
I love that. I have seen this, and it always gives me comfort, and at the same time, I love being a millennial now, and then we get to say this about Gen Z, so it's
Yep.
nice to pass that down, and Gen Z will still soon be saying that about Gen Alpha, and so it's the
Right.
circle of life, but I do think that, yeah, it is a constant dynamic and something we talk to business owners about all the time is they do feel that way, and I think it's a question of, okay, how can you I think that's such a nice way to tie this out, which is like, how can you use technology as a means to meet your next generation workforce where they are, where they really excel too, which is adopting new technology, finding ways to streamline. There's a lot of opportunity there to make jobs easier and lives a little bit better. And I think that's a fun frontier. And with some motivation, it'll work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you said it best. I don't have anything to follow that, so I think I think that's good.
Awesome. Well, Alec, thank you for the time
Yeah.
today. It was great doing this, and thanks for everyone who joined in.